So hi everybody, welcome back to the Transnormal Pod. I'm Laura T, and I'm joined here today with my co-host Joe. And happy to join you again for what I think is our 6th episode, is it?
6.
Yeah, 6 episodes. There. Yeah, and today's actually a very exciting day because we finally broke big, or at least I finally broke big, and I didn't have to get involved or be falsely accused of bringing down an airliner to get my big break with fame, because both Joe and I appeared this week in a very important article in the New York Times, where I was quoted as a Canadian gastroenterologist because of this podcast. So it turns out Nick Confessor, who wrote this very long piece, I think it was an 11,000 word piece, detailing sort of where the trans movement lost its way when it came to defending the Skrmetti decision. And he happened to be, I guess, looking for some source material and came across this podcast and reached out to Joe and I for our thoughts about, as being people who are primarily, not involved in trans politics quite so much and not identified with sort of the more radical fringes of trans politics, for our thoughts about sort of the place of trans in society, and particularly how some of the advocacy that the sort of traditional trans advocates have been pushing may not be in the best interest of trans people like you and myself. And so what did you think of the article?
I loved it. I loved how much of a all-inclusive timeline it put together. I don't know of many pieces that had such a all-encompassing, here's where it was, here's what kind of happened with all the behind the scenes of WPATH and the Biden administration and the Trump administration and just all of these pieces that showed. My initial impression was not on the Supreme Court ruling, but more so my initial impression on what led to kind of the falling apart of the trans activism that was working was all of the political posturing behind the scenes, that people were doing things not because they thought it was the best, but they thought it was the best way to win something. Like, they were taking out age requirements because they thought if they left them in, then they wouldn't win or they wouldn't get what they needed, even though they didn't necessarily agree with taking out age requirements, for example. And there was a lot of that kind of stuff behind the scenes that I was shocked to see was more about how to score a victory than it was about how to advocate for what they really believed was best. On top of that, a little bit of some people advocating for, I think, ideologies that just wouldn't have worked anyway. And once the veil came off and more of the behind the scenes was revealed, I think that's when it showed that it was sitting on very shaky ground. A lot of the science behind it or claims that were being made. And that was kind of my impression, was like, oh, there was a lot of political back channeling that kind of self-destructed the whole process.
Yeah, now I saw this too, and I've, was obviously watching it a little bit in real time and paying close attention to it, as a physician who practices, or at least tries to practice, evidence-based medicine. And also, obviously, my personal biases of being like trans people are generally good people, and that I'm someone who had gender dysphoria and was successfully treated for it and have had a great life. So I've got my own personal biases sort of in favor of access to therapies, and also knowing many people who started their transition as teenagers who have had, where it's really worked for them and they've been successful, productive adults. And what I also recognize that a lot of people have an animus towards trans people. And so the trans community, the trans advocacy groups did an excellent job at marketing, and I think to some extent drinking the Kool-Aid in terms of the science that supported its work, because the initial studies were positive, at least on pediatric gender transition. People who were involved in treatment, and also people who have lived experience, and especially the ones who had a good experience that became the advocates for the movement, and obviously became very strong advocates for allowing this therapy. And it didn't really matter what the data was because they knew from their own lives how well it worked. And I think also the people who were involved in providing gender affirming care remember their success stories. And they also remembered what it was like before these therapies were available. And they saw these transformational effects that really stood out to them. Now, that can be a form of bias because you remember these very dramatic positive effects, and you might not remember that person who just quietly stopped coming to your clinic, or that person who was a bit depressed and stayed a bit depressed, and they were kind of muddled before and they were kind of muddled after, but whatever. Those aren't the memorable cases. And so when people start to look a little more deeper and say, you know what, maybe this data wasn't as strong, there became a movement to say, if we show any sign that there's a chink in the armor. So we couldn't show any weakness, because if we showed any weakness, our enemies would exploit that weakness to make the case of, which they eventually did do successfully, that that this kind of care should be banned. Whereas if they were reasonable, they would have said, you know what, the data isn't perfect, we need to work on getting better data, but on balance, it seems to be positive. This seems to be doing most kids a favor. But they knew that if they showed any weakness, people would exploit it. And so they took a bet, which ended up being a losing bet, that they could sort of talk around the equivocal nature of the data and rely on sort of narratives and human experience and hope that no one would take enough of an interest to really look deep at the data. And that fell apart probably around 2017, when what I believe is right-wing organizations decided they were going to make this a focus, and they were going to spend the money to really look at this data and find the chinks, because there were groups around before then, like GenSpec, like the Society for Evidence-Based Medicine and Genders, or Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, who kind of were poking around the edges, but they weren't very well funded. And so once they got the funding in place and the support, they could really start to really both do some of the work to tear down and exploit some of these chinks in the armor, and also to create a very powerful narrative that they got in front of social media and the general media about gender medicine having its flaws.
Right, or what I saw was like being experimental.
Or being experimental, or not life-saving, as it was commonly purported to be.
Yeah.
Or that, and then, we started, and then there was this secondary wave, of course, of the changing nature of the demographics of the kids who were presenting from being people who, let's say before 2015, were primarily ones who are more, at least demographically, like myself, young natal boys, primarily gender dysphoric from a young age, who came from supportive families, who did very well, to one where they were primarily or increasingly natally female, higher burdens of psychosocial disruption, higher burdens of mental illness, poorly functioning in their pre-transition life, who were now reporting what they believed were symptoms of gender dysphoria in their teenage years, as opposed to people who were reporting it, or at least had some objective evidence of it in their teenage years. And we started to suspect that maybe these outcomes were not going to be as strong.
You brought up an interesting point there. Going back to, you had said they were exploiting like the weak evidence, and I think that's very profound what you said, because it's maybe not profound but revealing, because we've always said if we had more studies and more funding, then it could be safer. It could be, we could have a better idea of the pros and the cons, and especially with like long-term hormone therapy use and just different things that we don't know. And it's interesting that it wasn't until a political party put a lot of money into finding out all of the issues with it that we finally got more data. And I don't know what you think about that. Like, to me, that's just sad that we don't really care until we're trying to score political points on certain healthcare that's emerging.
Yeah, no, I think the left, and I think people practicing gender-affirming care, just sort of took it for granted. Like, there was this wave of pro-LGBTQ sentiment that was moving through society with, legalizing gay marriage and inclusion of gays and lesbians in broader, in broader society. And I think trans people came along for the ride and were able to benefit from a lot of the goodwill that people had towards LGBTQ people. So when trans people were saying, look, this works, this transforms damaged kids into healthy adults. People wanted, that story was easy to believe, and there was no real reason to question it.
Right.
Because you're like, trans people are good people. What's wrong with having more trans people? It was only, so it was only when you started getting this opposite. So there originally wasn't this need to get more data. If you were to ask trans physicians, they actually didn't want to do the higher quality studies because they believed, and they believed it in their hearts of hearts, that this was so effective that it wouldn't be proper to do a trial where the actual therapy of gender-affirming care was going to be withheld. Like, that was the thought. And I believe that myself too, because my impression was that this was highly effective. And it would be improper to randomize people to getting no therapy or even delayed therapy when we knew that this was the treatment. And so there wasn't really an impetus because we thought we had this. We thought this was in the bag. And it was only once the opposition rose up and started really publicizing or taking note of some of the limitations of the studies that were done, that the gender affirming community started to sort of go along with this call for higher quality research. And even now, some people are still lagging behind. I think there's still some people who really want to hang on, and probably crafted by their personal narratives, by their personal successes. And physicians, once again, who are practicing this, who aren't corrupt, they truly believe, rightly or wrongly, and it may be proven in the end that they were right, they truly believe that this is the best choice for most children. But, I think this is probably a good time actually to bring in our first guest. We're going to be joined right away by an attorney whose name is Dilan Esper. Dilan Esper is a California attorney who I've come to know primarily through his activity in Twitter, because he's been what I find to be very even-handed commenter on the trans discourse, and also and brings with him a legal background that makes him very knowledgeable. And I find he tends to approach these issues not from a pro-trans perspective or an anti-trans perspective, but from a pro-law perspective and a pro-reasonable perspective. And he too was one of the people who was extensively quoted in the Nick piece in the New York Times. So I thought this would be a good place to bring him on, especially in light of the recent Skrmetti versus the United States decision, which of course was decided in favor of Skrmetti, the Attorney General in Tennessee, which upholds not only the ban in Tennessee, but all 27 statewide bans on pediatric gender-affirming care. So I thought it'd be good to bring him in for his perspective on Skrmetti. I'm a bit of a dabbler. I have my opinions on it, but I thought it'd be good to have some legal background. So I'd like to welcome Dilan in. I'm just going to admit him. Good morning.
Hello.
Hello, how are you doing today?
I'm okay.
Okay, so I just wanted to introduce you to our audience, and also to introduce us to you. So Dilan Esper is a lawyer practicing in California, and Dilan is sort of I'm looking for a better word than dilettante, but someone who I've come to sort of know through his what I've found to be very insightful posts on a number of issues relating to the law and current events, in particular on gender issues. And I sort of started following him because I found he had some very interesting insights on the intersect between law and gender medicine, particularly in pediatric gender medicine. And we sort of followed each other and quoted quoted each other and sort of followed along. And I've always appreciated like what I thought was his very sort of down the center, even-handed takes on gender medicine, which were not necessarily pro-gender or anti-gender, but were sort of pro-normalcy and pro-reasonableness. And you were also, quote, involved in the Nick piece that was published in the New York Times Magazine this past week, relating to sort of where some of the mistakes or where the gender lobby lost its way in defending pediatric gender medicine. And so what I thought would be great to have you on. So with that, I'm just going to sort of just give you a quick hello, because I know we've met online, but I don't think we've ever met in person, or we've ever seen each other's faces face to face. So I'm Laura Tragonic, and I'm one of the hosts of the Transnormal Pod, and I'm joined here by Joe Ellis.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Hello.
And maybe you could just introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about how you became interested in sort of the law as it pertains to gender medicine, or the role of gender in society in general.
Well, so my name's Dilan Esper. I am a media law lawyer who does mostly appellate work here in California. So certainly my primary vocation right now more concerns defamation claims and copyright claims and other things that might come up in media litigation, privacy claims, etc. And I've done plaintiff side work and defendant side work and continue to do so. But in my past, I was very much involved in civil rights law. And specifically, my first legal jobs of any importance were with the ACLU and a group called Urban Recovery Legal Assistance, which was working with victims of the 1992 civil unrest in Los Angeles, which is an issue that has come back into the fore recently. And then I spent a number of years early in my career as a sort of go-to brief writer for the local ACLU on First Amendment claims. And I developed a specialty for a while in international human rights claims, which they would go to me on until, unfortunately, the Supreme Court after 9/11 kind of shut that area of American law down. And that kind of, and what is why I ended up being a source for the New York Times on this is because I've seen the ACLU up close. In terms of gender, I just came to that mostly as a Twitter user, although I have had, I have worked on some cases involving trans people. I have a brief, an amicus brief in a pending case before the Fifth Circuit, asserting the First Amendment rights of drag queens.
Okay.
Against a Texas law that purports to ban drag performances. I haven't done a ton of legal work in the gender area, but, the gender issue came up, and it's a long and complex story, but it certainly became the thing that I would say actually, and like each side kind of blames the other for this, but I think both sort of the left, the advocacy left, and the traditionalist religious right decided for their own reasons, after gay rights battles appeared to have been won by the civil rights side, that both sides decided we're going to switch over to trans issues for various reasons. And I think that, honestly, I think that is why society has very much centered trans issues and trans debates for the last 10 years, much to, I think, the proper chagrin of a lot of people who care about these issues and who care about trans people, because what has actually happened is this sort of food fight of very extreme positions on both sides, with not, in my opinion, sufficient humanity for the actual people being affected by this.
and I have to say, for trans people themselves, so if I was to go back to, let's say the late 2010s, so, as many of our viewers know, I transitioned in Los Angeles, starting in 2000. And I was sort of ready to ride off into the sunset, as someone who was sort of like just living their normal life and not really publicly identified as being trans, and who thought sort of the battle was won. I was kind of like, on the sidelines, going on like, yay for trans people, like we finally made it, but not feeling the need to get too involved in it, because I thought the battle was kind of won, and then kind of caught almost blindsided by sort of the fact that both, as I sort of recognized in retrospect, sort of the more trans advocates are really trying to normalize parts of the trans experience that were not sort of consistent with my experience, but sort of sensing this increasing liberalization in society and sort of saying, yeah, they'll accept everything we do now. And the right wing sort of also saying, no, we got to put a stop to this because we've lost the gay rights movement and we really need to reassert our supremacy. And the trans movement's doing a lot of crazy things that the public doesn't know about, and we need to sort of bring this to the public attention. So I think that is more or less correct. So, one of the reasons, like I said, we want to have you on today is because we've obviously been talking a lot about the upcoming, or now the completed, Skrmetti versus the United States case, which I'm sure many of our viewers and watchers will know was decided this past week, where the state of Tennessee, who had instituted a broad pediatric care ban, which was basically going to prohibit doctors from diagnosing gender dysphoria and engaging in any treatment of gender dysphoria, including any medical transition, any surgeries, but also even any psychological support that is affirming of gender. And this was struck down by a district court and eventually found its way to the Supreme Court, which upheld in a 6-3 ruling that the state rule was constitutional in that it could prohibit trans children from receiving this care, even though other children who aren't trans would potentially be able to receive similar types of care as long as it was consistent with their gender. And so what I really want to ask you from your perspective of a lawyer is, what's next? So we know these states obviously are going to keep their bans in place. There's 23 other states that to date have not passed bans, and many of them may in the future, depending on local politics. What my worries are, especially as a trans adult, is, one, might this ruling be extended to prohibit care for people like myself who are living in the United States, particularly in red states that would be keen to pass those kind of laws? And second, does this allow for broader discrimination against trans people in other walks of life? So if we can discriminate against trans people or trans children in medical care, does this open the door to saying, well, trans people are not worthy of the protection of being a protected class? Can we discriminate against them in housing and workplace protections and, in the military, which is in Joe's experience? Are there any concerns about things of that nature?
So Skrmetti is one, not quite as bad as it could have been for trans people.
How so?
But two, pretty bad for trans people. There's two things that the court didn't do that are important here. The maximal bad result. The first, and this is one that is, I get met with a certain amount of scorn, especially from the far left when I say, but it's true if you know something about the history of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has at times engaged in extremely cruel rhetoric towards minority groups when they dismiss their rights claims. The most famous example everyone learns, even non-lawyers learn in school, is the Dred Scott case, which involves slavery. And, again, this kind, to make the sort of left-wing critique about myself, someone might say to me, Dylan, who cares about the language? The ruling was so bad. And yeah, I get that. But part of what we learn is that Chief Justice Taney in the Dred Scott case not only rejected the claim of the former slave Dred Scott, but also said, quote, a black man has no rights that a white man is duty bound to respect, end quote. That's a famous line from the opinion. In other words, Taney didn't just say, well, technically, a former slave has no right under the due process clause to make a claim against, a state trying to reinstall him into slavery, or a slave who crosses a boundary into a free state is still a slave. Those would both be terrible things to say, but he doesn't just stop there and resolve the legal way. He dumps on black people and says that they don't have any rights at all. In Bowers versus Hardwick, which was the case in the 1980s where the Supreme Court upheld sodomy statutes, since been overturned. But in that statute, in that case, the Supreme Court explicitly dumped on the claims of any civil rights for gay people. It called them facetious. In Lawrence versus Texas, which is the case that overturned Bowers, Justice Scalia, in dissent, went off on a screed against what he called, quote, the homosexual agenda, end quote.
Well,
and, I've apologized to your audience for quoting these things. It's harsh stuff. But the point is, the Supreme Court has in the past really not just rejected legal claims, which is what their job is. Do we think this is a good legal claim or not? But it really just dumped on minority groups. That didn't happen on Wednesday, and it's important that it didn't happen. It is important that even the people who rejected the rights claims of trans people did it in a pretty respectful manner, and indeed even recognized some of the concepts that trans people it would have been actually kind of beyond the dreams of trans people 40 years ago for the Supreme Court to recognize. Like the justices are saying gender dysphoria is real, that transition is real. You hear in right-wing circles stuff like, this is all a mental delusion, and this is all these people are all mentally ill, and they're incompetent at doing anything, and if they hold any sort of job or any sort of place in society, their mental illness interferes with their ability to be full members of society. Well, if Justice Scalia were alive, he'd probably be saying stuff like this.
Yeah.
But this court, all 9 justices, even the people who took the strongest positions rejecting trans people's rights, none of them said anything like that.
Yeah. Like the one thing that someone pointed out is that nobody misgendered any of the.
That's right. Nobody misgendered.
Yeah.
These litigants, and nobody called anybody by a dead name.
Yeah.
So
in the sense that it wasn't bad in terms of its tone, like I can appreciate that, but in terms of the likelihood that this will be used as a precedent or as a stalking horse to do some of the things, like I think if you were to ask the average trans person about what the result of Skrmetti was going to be, there was a vanishingly small minority that thought that the trans community was going to win that case on the merits. Maybe people had their fingers crossed that something would happen to incapacitate some part of the right wing of the court. But really, that was the only path to victory. This was a lost case. What people were worried about is what's next. And will this be used as a precedent or rationalization to say, well, since Skrmetti passed, the state has an interest in banning all trans care for adults because it is also on methodologically shaky grounds, or we think we're protecting our population, or similarly, and Joe can tell her story about being separated or soon to be separated from the military. Yeah. That there are what are the words that are used, Joe, to describe why trans people are not suited for the military?
Because we're inconsistent with a truthful lifestyle. Even in our personal life, and it's not an honorable way to live, basically, is what the animus says. And that's my fear, is that more of that's going to happen towards adults now that, kids have been kind of settled to an extent. But I'm curious to hear your opinion, sir. Yeah,
so give us the legal perspective. Are our fears warranted, or is this?
Yeah. I did want to say my second sunny side point here, besides they were respectful in tone. The other thing they did not do, which is potentially important for trans people down the line, is that there were 3 justices in concurring opinions who wanted to announce for all eternity that transgender people were not a protected class under the Constitution. And if that had carried 5 votes, that would mean that any law that discriminates based on transgender status would be reviewed only for rationality. And rationality is the very lowest standard. and is very easy to meet.
Yeah, so you're talking about the different levels of scrutiny that are required to,
Exactly.
Yeah.
And under rationality, I mean, you still can't pass a law based on pure animus, so that if a trans plaintiff was able to come in and say, the only reason the state passed this law, or the only reason the federal government did this is because they hate trans people, they might still win the case. But anything short of that, anything where the government can articulate, no, we have a reason to do this, even if it's not a very good reason, even if the legislation doesn't seem to fit that reason very well, that's enough to uphold the statute under rational basis. So it was extremely important that that position, that trans discrimination based on a person's transgender status is not a suspect classification, only got 3 votes. It didn't get
So
5.
when Alito or Amy Coney Barrett writes that in a concurrence, it doesn't hold the legal weight of law, but those concurrences still play a role in the future.
So it's quite the opposite from the legal weight of law. You write a concurrence or a dissent that makes a point precisely because you can't get 5 votes. This is, I mean, one of the things I talk about in terms of the Supreme Court generally is that the discourse around court opinions is quite broken. And this is one of the ways it is. Every time the Supreme Court does anything, and I'm not saying this as a cheerleader of the Supreme Court, there's plenty wrong with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's justices generally do not share my ideology, but nonetheless, someone, Clarence Thomas will write something in a dissent, and the whole Supreme Court commentary apparatus will point at it and say, see this extreme thing Clarence Thomas wrote in dissent, and it's like, yeah, he got 1 vote for it.
Yeah, so it's not law.
It's not law. You can't do anything without 5 votes. Through having only 3 votes for that is, I swear to you, it sounds like it's bad, but it's good news. It literally means that the Republicans would have to appoint 2 more people to the court, replacing 2 of the liberal justices or 2 of the conservative justices who did not go along with it. And even if they got those appointments, that the new people they appointed would necessarily turn out to agree with Barrett, Thomas, and Alito. And we can see from the current court, not everybody agrees with Barrett, Thomas, Alito. Specifically, I think it's pretty obvious that Gorsuch, who authored the Bostock opinion a few years ago, which was very the most pro-trans
and
court
for our
ruling
listeners,
in American history.
The Bostock opinion is the opinion that basically said that that when you discriminate on trans status, you're actually discriminating on sex, and discriminating on sex is legal, so you can't discriminate on someone on the basis of their trans status, correct?
And well, yeah, although it's important to qualify Bostock, because we're going to probably talk about Bostock here. Bostock was an employment discrimination case. But to be clear, employment discrimination is really important. It's super important. The brass tacks importance of Bostock to trans rights is that if you are, say, a bank teller and you transition, you were assigned male at birth and you start showing up to work wearing dresses and makeup and say, I have a new name now. And the bank can't fire you for that.
Which is huge.
Because of Bostock. Yeah. It's gigantic.
Yeah.
So, and Gorsuch was the author of that. And John Roberts, the Chief Justice, joined the Bostock opinion too. And those 2 justices probably, I would say very likely, are signaling we don't agree with Barrett, Thomas, and Alito that transgender people are necessarily not going to be a suspect class. That's why that position didn't get 5 votes. It honestly would have been really easier for the court to decide the Skrmetti case if it had gotten 5 votes.
Yeah.
The chief had to engage in some rather circuitous routes to get to the result he wanted, precisely because he didn't want to rule that transgender people were not a suspect class. So that's actually a piece of good news buried in Skrmetti.
So wrapping up the sunny side.
That's the end of the sunny side.
What should we be worried about?
In the short term, there are several sets of cases that had already been appealed by the Supreme Court and were awaiting the Supreme Court, and we're awaiting the decision in Skrmetti. And I assume that all those cases, they're going to well, I know that they're going to be vacated and be sent back down to the lower courts. That's the standard Supreme Court line. But with having the Skrmetti case having come down, I think the trans plaintiffs in those cases are all going to lose them.
Yeah.
So
Those
there
are the
are
other
other
pediatric
cases. Right. There are other cases like Skrmetti and that involved pediatric care. And I think after this, those cases are going to go against the trans plaintiffs.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to say, Joe, there are challenges to the military ban and that had reached the Supreme Court. And I think those are going to be vacated in light of Skrmetti, and the challengers are going to lose those claims on the way down. And then there were a few other state trans bills of various sorts mostly involving sports.
Yeah.
And, we can talk about sports and we can talk about the legality of sports, where sports thing should come down. But the bottom line is, obviously, there were trans plaintiffs in those cases, mostly high school trans girls who were hoping to compete
what we really care about,
and they're going to
I agree with you on sports that it's a side issue, it's a distraction. Like, most trans people aren't playing sports, it just gets people riled up. But what I care about, or what I would care about if I was American, would be, can I get my hormone replacement therapy? Will my surgeries become illegal for a physician to practice, or made so onerous that a physician won't do it because the insurance rates go so high, or things of that nature? Like, is that a legitimate concern that someone, I'm fortunate, I live in Canada. I'm exempt from the Supreme Court ruling as a result, or at least for now. But like Joe, as an example, I'm sure wants her access to HRT, and should she, if there are any surgeries that she wants that are considered to be gender affirming, or in the future, maybe, those are the kind of things that she'd want access to, or people, or hundreds of thousands of people like us.
So there's not going to be an immediate impact on that because, as I said, the cases in the pipeline are as I described. There were sports cases, there were military cases, and there were other gender affirming care for youth cases. And as I said, the trans plaintiffs in all those cases are probably going to lose them. We have to see what states and the federal government does. There are some bad signs coming down the pike with the Trump administration on the issue of healthcare. And, that I think I've stated this long ago. My big worry on this issue was that the right wing was going to eventually figure out that like their great white whale is healthcare for adults, because right now, honestly, as a lawyer, I can see this. There's a fundamental contradiction that has always been in place between the way the healthcare system delivers healthcare to trans people and the issue of what gets labeled in the broader cultural debate as self-identification.
Yep.
So if usually your model for healthcare and how things get covered by health insurance is you have some sort of medical condition. You go to your doctor, you get healthcare, and then there are coverage mandates that are imposed mostly by statutes like Obamacare and by the Medicare statute and by the regulations under them that require the healthcare companies to pay for these things. So, if you have appendicitis and you go to the doctor and they have to take out your appendix, and then the insurance company pays for that.
But your concern is that because some are advocating that it's not. It's a decision, it's fluid, it's all these things, that it's not a medical condition, then there would be no justification to treat it, right?
Yeah, I'm worried that if you listen to, and I shouldn't just say it's not just a rhetorical worry, I suspect this is true of the reality on the ground. I think there are probably a number of trans people in America who haven't adults I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the much more fraught issue of
Yeah.
what's going on with use. But trans adults who don't have like a formal diagnosis of gender dysphoria,
There's a lot of them.
yeah,
Yeah.
Well, with
just
informed consent,
they're just
you don't need
they're
one.
just transitioning, and under democratic administrations, things were set up at the behest of the trans legal movement without a lot of public scrutiny, but this happened where they're getting their health care paid for because it's treated as a health insurance issue.
Yeah.
And if you think about that, so again, as a lawyer, just sort of categorically, it's a little weird because like we have this whole other area of healthcare that is healthcare that involves the changing of people's appearances, that health insurance, but which doesn't involve a formal diagnosis of anything, of any condition,
and which
where health insurance companies do not pay for it. It's cosmetic surgery.
So the insurance thing is like one lever. So of course he can decide we're not going to Medicaid and Medicare aren't going to pay for these procedures anymore, and anyone not using those services aren't going to get coverage, they'll have to pay out of pocket, which frankly is how it was when I transitioned. I paid for every cost out of pocket back in 2000, 2001. And the other, and then they can also put pressure on, even in blue states, and saying, we're not going to fund your hospitals if you have clinics that provide this care. And those are probably legal, I imagine. People can challenge them. But what I'm worried about personally is sort of the equivalent of a ban to say that if you're a physician, you cannot prescribe these drugs. You cannot refer people to get these drugs. You cannot refer someone to have surgery, to another doctor, whether in your state or out of state. And
you're saying the same thing that happened to kids could a state ban that care to adults, and would that hold up with the state ruling?
Intermediate position. I think there's an intermediate position there. I haven't thought about what would happen if there was a flat ban, because I don't think the president has the power to impose one. I think a state might pass one.
Well, that's what I mean.
That's
like if Tennessee decides we're going to ban adult care.
So let's take the intermediate position to go to the full position.
Yeah.
I think what is a grave danger in the United States is something more than just pressuring the hospitals and more than just Medicaid, direct federal funding of healthcare. I think there's a lot of room under the Obamacare statute, which regulates every health insurance policy in this country. I think there's enormous room under the Obamacare statute. This was what I was always worried about, for the federal government to say that for this to be covered, it has to tie into a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. That if you don't have a long clinical record, going back a certain amount of time of going into the doctor and getting gate kept for this and having, a gender dysphoria diagnosis, then this is like elective surgery and this is elective medication. And, the government's not going to pay for it.
Sure.
And your insurance company is not going to pay for it because your insurance company is subsidized by Obamacare. And do I think the federal government could get away with that after Skrmetti? Very possibly. Now, taking the scenario of a ban, again, a ban would have to pass Congress. I don't think it can.
Sure.
I don't think you can ban. Yeah, you can't ban this as a medical treatment for a medical condition through Obamacare. That doesn't give you could try to change the scheduling of some of the drugs involved in transition through the FDA process, but that takes a long time to do and is challengeable in court. Yeah. So, and is challengeable on court on other grounds than Skrmetti. So I don't think that's easy.
But if I lived in Alabama and the Alabama state legislature decided they were going to ban an adult ban, I'm just picking a red state at random. What's standing in their way?
So I think Skrmetti kind of deliberately leaves that open. So Skrmetti, on the one hand, talks a lot about medicine, but on the other hand, talks a lot about age. And, Skrmetti could have been written to emphasize the medicine point more. And if it had been, I would say trans people are in a lot of trouble in states where this could pass. It wasn't quite written that way. And there's a number of things in the opinion where they talk about the fact that this is an age classification as well as a medical treatment classification, and that because of the age of the patients, the government has, a special interest in
protecting the rights of children.
Yeah. So we don't know. The Skrmetti opinion also leaves open the possibility of an animus-based challenge. Those arguments worked very well for a time for gay people, where they were able to identify state laws where the state asserted some sort of, conceivable interest in what they were doing, but the Supreme Court was able to see through that and say, this is animus. This was motivated by, just a dislike of gay people. And that's still open. The court, whatever one thinks of this, I happen to think the Tennessee law was a pretty cruel law that was designed to target trans kids, but the court didn't see it that way, and the court saw legitimate reasons for doing this. But that doesn't preclude the court in another case with a broader law from saying, this one, unlike the Tennessee one, really does look like it's just targeting trans people.
Yeah.
And by the way, I would say, this is a weird person to cite on this, but look at Alito's opinion on that. Because Alito's opinion, he would not grant suspect class status to trans people. But to get to that conclusion, he kind of tears the majority apart a little on their conclusion that this doesn't discriminate against trans people. He says, no, I looked at this Tennessee statute. It looks to me like it does discriminate against trans.
But he's okay with it.
How can you treat it otherwise?
Yeah.
So, but that's important because it shows you that if you had a statute that came along that looked entirely irrational, probably I wouldn't hold out for Alito's vote on it. But Alito's reasoning could get cited by 5 justices.
And that's what I think we're hoping for with the military ban, is that they haven't provided any evidence, and the idea there is that it's purely animus. But I'm not sure how that will get pushed down with the recent ruling, if that really affects it or not. But the military, I think, has a little bit of differences, right? Versus the employment case. You could say, well, if the employment case, Bostock was ruled, then why wouldn't that apply to the military? And then, of course, the argument back, I guess, is that the military can discriminate based on all sorts of medical conditions, right? And then it goes back to, is gender dysphoria disqualifying or not?
It's worse than that. The military was always the most difficult case for trans people to win because of a case called Rockster versus Goldberg, which was in the early 1980s. And Rockster versus Goldberg involved a challenge to the male-only draft.
Oh, okay.
And this is sex discrimination, which is, we can get into its relation to transgender discrimination, but it's kind of the basis for any claims about transgender discrimination is the court's prohibition on sex discrimination, which is sex is given very tough scrutiny by the court when a law discriminates against sex, against people on the basis of sex. But in Rockster, the court said that this did not apply to the female-only draft. That
interesting.
The male-only draft, because the court said you have to defer to the military. And back then, this is not true now, obviously, but back then, the military had a whole bunch of different classifications regarding sex. Right. They said women couldn't serve in combat. They said women couldn't pilot certain types of planes. They couldn't be on certain sorts of Navy ships. They had all sorts of rules where women could and couldn't serve. And the court said, that's military policy. We don't want to have some lower court come in and issue a court injunction against, an invasion of a country because there aren't enough women
Right.
in the units. Yeah. So, they basically said that if the military asserts a justification for sex discrimination, we're going to accept it.
Yeah.
That's a really great point. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Rochester is still good law. And despite all the cases that have ruled on sex discrimination since 1981, Rochester is still good law. And the trans plaintiffs, even without Skrmetti, were always going to have a tough go at it because the government could always say, this is just like Rochester. If we make a determination that there can't be trans people in a certain unit, or they can't be trans people in a certain part of the military, or they can't be trans people in any part of the military, you have to defer to us because, we
know things you don't.
We're fighting the wars, and war is too important to have courts come in and
tell us what to do.
Sort of rulings.
Wow. Yeah. Well, that's very informative. Thank you so much for your time today. This has been really interesting, and we might have to bring you back in for more as more of these come down. Yeah.
You can be our legal consultant because it's clear that it's not just a Twitter thing. You're clearly very knowledgeable on the law. So once again, thank you for joining us here today, and also joining us at 6:30 in the morning because you're coming in from California, and we're taping early in the morning here on the East Coast. Thank you for your time, and hopefully we'll hear from you again.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. We'll bring Rachael in.
Hi.
Gotcha. Yeah, so thanks for joining us. Good morning.
Thanks for having me. Hi, Joe.
Hello.
You and I haven't talked before, so...
No, I think we've maybe interacted a little bit back and forth, but it's so nice to see you and to meet you. This is so exciting.
Yeah, and it's very exciting to see you and talk to you in person. I know we've had a few chats offline. So we're bringing on actually someone I sort of met through my sort of Twitter activities named Rachael Mae. It's okay to call you Rachael Mae?
Of course, that's totally fine.
That's totally your name. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I was very intrigued and why I really wanted to have Rachael on is because, I've come from a progressive background. I'm Canadian, so it comes by me naturally. And I've always, throughout my transition and throughout my life, I've generally been moving in fairly progressive spaces and progressive institutions. I work at a university, at a hospital. I work in healthcare. Sort of my progressive attitudes have always been a good fit here, and I've never really been questioned. And of course, most of the trans people that I've come across in my life, both through my early part of my transition, when I transitioned in Los Angeles in a very sort of liberal, in a very liberal enclave. And then through sort of the 15 or 16 years of my life when I was not publicly trans, but was still sort of living in a liberal city, voting liberally, working at a liberal institution, and taking on generally progressive views on sort of world events, including my support for the LGBTQ community as sort of someone who identified at that point primarily as an ally, to the last few years as I've come out, where most of the trans community that I've interacted with have also been in the progressive space. And so when I started coming across people like Rachael, who came from a different political valence, but were still making what I thought were sort of solid arguments and rationalizations for their points of view, but coming at it from a very different political lens, I found this personally very intriguing as someone who, to be honest, doesn't have a lot of day-to-day interactions on a face-to-face basis with people who self-identify or as conservatives. And most of my interaction with conservatives have mostly been as my opposition, and not necessarily just on trans issues, but on political issues in terms of foreign policy, in terms of economic policy, in terms of social policy. And so we always talk about how it's important for people from different sides of the political aisle to be able to reach across and talk and understand perspectives. I thought it was really important to really understand, how does, being trans and being conservative, how do those mesh? Because if you had asked me 4 years ago, did they mesh? I'd be like, that's impossible.
Insane, right?
Yeah, those are completely different.
I get asked that question a lot, actually.
Yeah. So maybe just start by telling us a little bit about yourself, our audience.
Okay. Well, on Twitter, as you know, I'm the trans conservative, and people find that odd. A lot of people engage me without ever reading what it is that I say, which, kind of goes to where our political sphere is sitting at the moment. So how does conservatism and being trans fit? I always say that I'm a conservative that just happens to be trans. It's not part of the identity that I have or the politics that I have. I just happen to be so. Like you, most of the opposition that I have faced as well tends to come from progressives, actually. And, lately, I'd say in the last year or two, obviously the TERF movement has become something that obviously will just oppose anything with the word trans in it. So they don't really ever get a chance to explore my thoughts. On occasion, I get open-minded progressives and open-minded, more conservative people who will have a conversation with me, and they're generally pleasantly surprised at how I make these things go together, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
it makes sense to me. As someone who comes someone who comes from the right as well, grew up in that world. So no, I totally understand that, and it's tough, right? It's tough to square those two, because if you want to vote more conservative, but then a lot of the conservatives, at least running for office, will have views and want to institute things like the trans military ban or restriction to certain healthcare or whatever, right?
Right.
That, I think that's the really difficult part for me, is like I haven't been able to vote conservative since the golden escalator because of the rhetoric that comes out of someone who I truly don't believe is conservative. They're just weaponizing conservatism and uniting a party that has been fractured for so long, and now they have a lot of power, but I don't find them to hold any of those traditional conservative values that I would have aligned with. I find them to be some other thing. I don't know what to call it, but definitely not fiscally conservative.
Right. And actually, it's funny that you say that. I was an avid Trump supporter, both the first and second rounds. Third rounds, initially, I was kind of on a wait and see to see kind of where we went. And pre-election, a lot of the no new war stance, prescient today, along with, the idea that we were going to institute DOGE, cut governmental spending, and shrink the size of government was highly, highly appetizing to me. Joe, probably very much like yourself, I believe in a smaller, less powerful government in general. And I would like to see better representative democracy taking place in the House. So I have a lot of critiques about the current administration too, though they might not be kind of the typical ones that someone would assume just because I'm trans I would be critiquing. Sure. I think that specifically with the first executive order on the definition of two biological sexes, most people don't realize that actually came directly from Mae Mailman, who is the head of the Independent Women's Law Institute, long on record as being very much a bioessentialist and wanting to define these things. Trump brought her into the administration, and along comes that executive order. I find that hard to square with, Trump's previous stance on transgender issues in general up until this last election cycle. So, like you, I find it a little difficult to throw my full weight behind all of that, because in a lot of ways we're moving less from the executive order and more from the implementation of that policy into something that looks very dangerous for us in our healthcare, our representation for things like banking, or even just, continuing to exist in this way with employment protections and having the capacity to do our daily lives and live in peace, free from the government, which a conservative wants more than anything, is to just not be bothered as much as possible. So
I guess part of this is sort of some of the tension when I try to view the conservative movement as an outsider, is that there appears to be this tension definitionally on what is a conservative, primarily between sort of classic Burkean conservatism of sort of that things exist for a reason. Changing things should be taken, if you're thinking of changing things or being progressive, it should be with a very good reason, because there's reasons why things exist as they are. And then also sort of recognizing that the state is often a force for that, of trying to limit the powers of the state to make decisions in the lives of individuals, which, even as a progressive, I can understand the appeal of that as, like, I'm going to keep my business, you keep my business, and what you do doesn't affect me, your hand doesn't affect me until it hits my face, or there's some version of that phrase, which has a lot of appeal to me as someone who also, even as a progressive, does value personal liberty and the right of bodily autonomy and the right of people to make their own choices with their bodies and their lives. But then on the other hand, you have social conservatism, which takes on portions of just general principle conservatives, as in the social structures exist in the world the way they are for a reason, and we should be very cautious about making changes to social structures. And those include things like traditional values and the traditional definitions of marriage and how we bring children into the world and raise children. But at some point, if you believe those values to be true, it does, out of almost necessity, involve you needing to impose that will on people who believe differently. And so you end up with this tension between believing these values of conservatism of like family exists for a reason, we procreate for a reason, relationships between men and women exist for a reason, and also the fact that there are categories of men and women that exist for a reason. And we should not try to make these radical changes, but we cannot just count that, if you truly believe that, you can't just say, well, I'm just going to run my family this way, and I'm not going to care what a family who's two men living together, two women living together, someone who's changed gender, people who are raising their kids without traditional gender roles, whatever it might be that you think is different than the way things have traditionally been for thousands and thousands of years. It's almost imperative to try to impose your will or your values on that. And so that's always been a little bit of a struggle for me.
I understand that. And so we're right there, aren't we? Where the progressive mindset of everything goes and the socially conservative mindset of, we need to persist with the family, with, definition of marriage, definition of a man, definition of a woman. We're right there in this moment in time. When I think about conservatism in that light, one of the things that I always consider is what I call Little House on the Prairie conservatism. Okay. And I know that sounds funny, but, if you go back and you remember a time when, somebody might come to your gate who could be a threat to your home, to your family, they always welcomed them, they were kind to them, and then they encouraged them to move on. And if they didn't move on, then they instituted some sort of force to move you along. But the kindness always led first. And I feel like that kindness is missing in a lot of both progressive and conservative movements. I think that operationally, we're going through a time right now where definitions are being reformed. We went through this with gay marriage. We understood this. There was tons of talk about slippery slopes and, predation and all the things that we hear now kind of guided towards trans people. I don't think that that's an essentialist part, though, of what conservatism is. The concept of conservatism is the belief that you have a great deal of individual autonomy, but there are things about society, like you said, which work. And to change them takes a long time. And to change them, it should take, earnest consideration and earnest thought. It's not just wild, make a demand, walk through the space. You have to work with the people who you are trying to make change upon. To bring that back to a trans issue, I actually think that is one of the biggest reasons that we see individual conservative people really butting heads with what we would define as the TRA or the trans right activist, because, for them, they're making declarative statements and then enforcing them, and not just through speech, but through action. And I think that's kind of antithetical to exactly how conservatives want to proceed. And I absolutely hate the phrase, the pendulum swings. If I hear the pendulum one more time, I think I might lose it. But we are experiencing a severe backlash in the way that conservatives, and Joe, I'm sure you can speak to this, but I've seen a massive change in even just the public narrative within the Conservative Party. Before the last election, there was a lot of conversation about big tent. Everybody come here. This is the rationalization party. We make sense. We welcome people. We want everybody to live their best lives. Swing your hands. Just don't strike anybody in the face, right? Tons of that conversation prior to the election. Since the election, we're seeing something very different. We're seeing, people like Nancy Mace. We see the reaction to Representative. We see on both sides kind of a genuine lack of willingness to actually be a big tent party, which is probably my current primary criticism of conservatism, because, I always felt welcome in the Conservative Party, still do to an extent, one-on-one, but ideologically, I definitely feel that there is a significant movement towards trying to call what maybe the conservatives found to be out of control progressivism, redefinition of common things like what is a woman, thanks Matt Walsh for that question. But, definitely seeing this social conservative idea that you're talking about, Laura, that at some point you have to impose. I'm definitely starting to see that meter tip into imposition as opposed to welcome, let's have a conversation, let's rationalize through this, let's go through all of the pieces. I definitely think that we're starting to see exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. So, I think you bring up an important point, which is that conservatism is not inherently a revanchist movement. It doesn't inherently say this is how it is and this is how it's going to stay forever.
Correct.
But it involves sober thought and rationality, or at least it's supposed to involve sober thought and rationality to say an incremental change. Like, let's make small changes, see how they work. If they work, let's make another small change and see how it works. And, so I've positioned myself as a pragmatic progressive, which basically is trying to take those same principles of progressivism, but applying some of those same conservative principles of, yes, we might want this to be the end case. We might have a desired end state, but does this work? And in order for something to work, you've got to get people behind it. And what I've recognized has been sort of the cardinal sin of the progressive movement on trans issues is moving faster than the treadmill is running.
That's right. Missing consensus, essentially, is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Really, any change like that should be consensus building. And again, on specifically the trans rights side, there's a lot of people with zero interest in building consensus. So obviously, we're seeing this conservative pushback on, trans as a whole. I think one of the worst things that happened in the progressive side of pushing, expanding trans ideology, fighting for trans rights, was the definitional claim of trans women are women. That was a mistake. And the reason I say that is this, right now, encountering people who are transgender is confusing. There's a reason for it, and I can talk to that if you'd like, but encountering people who are transgender is confusing. There are tiers. We know that. We're from within it. If you've gone through your transition and you've reached your point where you're personally comfortable and you move on with your life, you just integrate and assimilate into society, correct? So when you do that, you become essentially invisible. A lot of people are like, why haven't I heard of you until like a year ago? Well, that's because I was busy being healthy and being happy and raising my children and enjoying my spouse and working my job and doing all the things that you do once you're healthy, right? But what we have right now is the largest megaphone is on a group of people that are not yet healthy. Okay, it's not to say that trans people are unhealthy, but it is a process that is designed to make you healthy and to overcome an issue that you are facing. And so in the case of what we were just referring to, definitionally, trans becomes very confusing to the average person who is not either hyper progressive or hyper conservative. They don't have an initial disgust towards a trans person. Honestly, it's usually curiosity. And at least from my experience, I'm sure you two can attest to that also. If I encounter just a random person on the street and don't know their ideology, and they haven't ever encountered someone like me before, they have questions, they're curious, I don't push on them with heavy duty political claims and say, trans women are women, and, I'm going to call you a birthing person, and I'm going to call you all this other stuff. That does not work, period.
Yeah.
And, conversations like have been occurring more recently. I'm seeing it more and more, even in used to be what we could call hyper progressive. They're coming back to the middle and saying, all right, hang on. We need to get away from the sloganeering. We need to get away from the non-quantifiable statements. And we have to start addressing reality where it is. We have to start addressing policy. Because really, at the end of the day, there are movements within this country to terminate trans healthcare, period. Not just for minors. Okay, which I'm perfectly on board with things regarding minors. Like, as a conservative, I'm like, wait, and I know you and I don't agree on that, Laura, but I'm okay in talking about minors separately. But as adults, it is not a conservative point of view, in my opinion, to impose the governmental will down upon a person to tell them to stop living a particular way, unless you can prove harm. So, of course, the idea is trans people stop committing harm against the community as a whole. Stop imposing without consensus, as we talked about before, what it is that you desire to be in the future. Have conversations with actual rationality, with the willingness to compromise, and with the willingness to be honest about where and who we are and what the goals are. I know a few weeks ago, Laura, I mentioned that I really wanted to talk about the RLE component, the real life experience component that used to be present in transition as like a step along the way. In my opinion, what we're seeing now is we have people who've gained access to hormones and then they freeze in the RLE component. Okay, the real life experience component in the prior treatment model was intended to put you into a situation where things about yourself, your preconceptions, your desires, your predilections, all the rest of it are challenged actively because you're living out in the world as the thing you wish to become to be, right? So if you are a trans man, you are living as a man out in the world and people are regarding you with some suspicion. Really a taught grace. It's humiliating as you could possibly imagine to the individual, which is why a lot of people are like, no, I don't want that. But really, it's a hardening process. It is a tempering process. And I think that freezing in that position where somebody is, happy to utilize cross-sex hormones as antidepressant treatment, but see what ends up
body
happening,
modification treatment,
or whatever the treatment is. A lot of times it's people they feel unhappy, they take hormones, they're like, oh my gosh, the world's so much brighter. Yes, that's true, but when you freeze in that place and you don't seek assimilation, but you make demands for integration, that's a problem. And so where we've reached is this place where you have, the turban argument of, men with beards and rainbow dresses walking into women's restrooms. We hear that stereotype coming at us all the time.
Yeah.
That is the cohort that I'm talking about that is frozen in the RLE. And you're supposed to move past that into an assimilation model. You work on yourself, seek to make yourself socially palpable to all of the, targeted demographics that you're trying to move into. And that seems to have been withdrawn in the last few years. I'd say probably the last 8 to 10 years.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting you bring that up, the RLE, because the military process is much more like that, to transition officially inside the military. And there actually is, for pilots, an 18-month RLE requirement, which is why I was grounded from flying the helicopter the minute I was diagnosed with gender dysphoria. It's because they recognize that RLE period is very important. And while I don't agree that it should be a mandatory 18 months, I think it should be up to the individual and the doctor and all of that. There is a time where that is very, like you said, difficult for the individual to go through as they're assimilating, right? And so 100%. For a pilot, you wouldn't want that possible mental load on a pilot on top of everything else. And so that's why they had that in there. And that remained, even though some of the other military policies became a little bit easier, didn't require a mandatory period, but did require RLE signed off by a psychologist, but it wasn't a mandatory time. The mandatory time stayed for the pilots. And I was always kind of appreciative of some of that aspect. I didn't like it that it was mandatorily 18 months, but I liked that they wanted to make sure you were going to be successful post-transition, basically. They wanted to make sure you could integrate. And so a lot of people tend to think with the military ban that that's the kind of trans people they're getting, is these trans people that don't have any of those requirements anymore. And that is what I've been trying to argue to people, is that no, actually the military still kept a lot of the gatekeeping that public did not. Yeah. And so it's like, and so we're being affected by that because the public perception is that trans in the military is the same as trans in public. And it's so different. It's more of the old school model, which is why so many trans service members have excellent records. They are integrated. They are still performing, in fact, performing better. And it's almost like a separate study. You could use trans military as a separate study from trans in the public space.
Yeah. So the other thing also, like just from my perspective, which is a little bit different. So I transitioned, I started in 2000. And 2000 was old school, but not old school, in the sense that most of the people who were transitioning, at least in my cohort, were looking at it as a transitory step. As in, you were doing this and it was going to be hard and you were going to look weird for a while and you were going to make a lot of mistakes. But there was some point where you would transition and live your life, not necessarily stealth, but as someone who could move in the world and be generally perceived to be female. Correct. And of course, recognizing the thing that was different from old school to old school is that they started recognizing they were taking in a lot of more people who maybe weren't going to necessarily hit that mark, but were still very dysphoric and would feel better, even if they would always stand out as being trans because of, bodily habitus or, just the cumulative effects of masculinization and socialization, but they were going to feel better. But the goal was still that you were not going to leave yourself in the middle. Whereas before me, if I was going to do this 10 years ago, that would have been the time when I would have had to come to my appointment sort of hyper effeminate in dress and fully made up for every appointment, because if I wore pants or sneakers, they would look at me as hanging on to vestiges of masculinity. So that wasn't where I transitioned. But what was starting to happen is that people started to say, well, people should be able to access this no matter what. And that started including people who were coming into transition for different reasons. Right. They were doing it to facilitate bodily changes because they just wanted to look different. So they wanted to look like women maybe, but not necessarily to be women in the world. Or were less concerned about being women in the world. They would be like, well, if I have to, I have to. I'm really doing this because I just don't want to see I just want to like what I see in front of the mirror for whatever reasons, whatever my motivations for that are. But I'm less concerned about coming across as feminine or as female in the world. And then eventually that evolving into sort of a lot of different forms of gender diversity and gender expression, which now where I'm at with that is like, if you were to ask me as a progressive, I'd say, fine. Live your life. Do whatever you want. Be you. If you want to be a blue hair, be blue hair. If you want to be a pink hair, be a pink hair. If you want to have a beard and wear a dress, wear a beard and wear a dress. That's fine. Right. Where the struggle really became was when you started to try to define legal rights around that. So I am less concerned about who's taking medication. As long as the doctor thinks it's in your best interest for whatever reason, the level of scrutiny I'm going to subject that to is relatively low. When it comes down to legalism, like what does it actually mean to become a woman and what I call the legal path to womanhood, that can't just be because I'm taking hormones. And that can't just be because I'm wearing a dress, and it can't just be because it has to mean something. Which brings me back to this point of when you say trans women are women, what I would push back on that and say at one time trans women were women. And then the definitional class of being trans and being a trans woman became so broad that it became apparent to the general public that many trans women weren't women. Right. And when you start saying that many trans women aren't women, it's easy to make the next jump to just say in general, as a general class, that trans women aren't women. And so I know that's maybe a little bit of a subtle differentiation from what you're saying, because if someone were to ask me, am I a woman? I would say yes still.
Hey,
And
and
you might
that's
say
fair.
differently. Yeah.
Well, it depends. I wouldn't necessarily say differently. It depends on
Yeah.
the context.
Yeah.
If somebody is asking me if I'm female, the answer is no. I am a male who presents to the world as a woman. Now, the TERFs are going to jump on that clip and be like, oh, well, claims to be a woman. It's not that. I don't force anyone to accept me as that. If they want to just simply regard me as a transsexual person, that's fine too. If I can rewind just a second to where you said, sometimes people just go on hormonal medication to feel better. I don't think that that's necessarily, as a conservative person, like a healthy thing. My approach to excuse me, the transgender pipeline or even transsexualism as a whole is that a person has to have a definitive objection to their natal sex. Like they have to be experiencing two primary criteria. That is, obviously, one is severe persistence, meaning this goes on over a period of time, significant period of time. This isn't a 12-month period of time. This is greater than that. And that persistence of feeling completely detached from who you are as a person, be feeling completely detached from what you are as a person, is not assigned to another comorbidity. It's not because you're undergoing a schizophrenic break, or that you have severe depression, or you have, extraordinary anorexia and a body dysmorphic disorder.
Like a
You
life
actually,
event, right?
what's that?
Like a life event, like you're
Yeah,
down on your luck, you're divorced
hey,
and you're broke,
my way
right?
out
Like,
is to become a woman. No,
right.
none of that. This has to be a persistent quality within you for a period of time. Now, if you can think from that framework, then the transitional process really is an atomic bomb. Okay, so in warfare, you have things you can do with bullets, you have things you can do with Black Hawk helicopters. See what I did, Joe? But then the atomic bomb is a last
You can
resort.
crash them.
You
Yes.
can crash them. Hopefully not. We're accused of all of
All
that.
right. You stuck the landing.
What's that? You stuck the landing.
Yeah.
You're funny. But the atomic bomb idea is, people from without transition, people that have not gone through it, don't understand what it really does to your entire life. If you fully transition, assimilate, and move into a whole new identity, your life changes, and it changes interpersonally. It can change or destroy your family structures if you're not careful and persistent and extremely intentional on maintaining those. It can change your work. It can absolutely change your access to things such as banking, employment, social clubs, even activities, in the terms of sports. People out here screaming like trans women should be included in sports. My own personal take is, look, if I have to do something to address a personal issue of my own, I might have losses that come along with that.
Sure.
Okay. And so, politically, it really comes back down to this concept of the transition process, in my opinion. Okay. And this includes hormones too. It should be the abortive final Hail Mary pass. To use a Trumpism, this is the right to try when all else is failing. If your dysphoria has been persistent, you've experienced severe debilitation, it's affecting your personal relationships, it's affecting your quality of life, it's affecting your employability, then it's time to start the process. Now, one of the other really tragic things, Laura, that in my opinion anyway, was that when we move this concept of, hey, here's my progressive ideology that accepts all people no matter how they look, medicalizing alongside of that is a problem, at least to me as a conservative person. Like, I'm like, if today you went through, Joe, like you were referencing, a serious breakup, and then suddenly you start feeling really terrible about your body, why did we see such a spike in hormone uses during COVID? Well, people were stuck. They watched a lot of online stuff. They started to look at themselves. During COVID, we didn't move much. People started gaining weight. They started getting some impressions about their body. And look, here's this, panacea out here online that's allowing me to go ahead and change how I look and who I am and what my strengths are and what my weaknesses are.
And acceptance, too, to a club.
Absolutely. A sense of identity and belonging. A few weeks ago, I made the point that back in the day, when you would enter an RLE state, you couldn't wait to get out of it. You're like, oh my gosh, when am I going to get there so that I can move on, right? But now, like, being in that state is the point. Like, you get attention for
Right.
being
in
Jeffrey
the
Marsh.
process.
Right.
But I think also there's the practical thing that some people who enter that state recognize that they're not interested in the final state.
Right. Well, in that case, though, I mean, how far do you want? I mean, let's say that I want radiation therapy.
Yeah.
And people are like, what are you talking about? You don't have the underlying cause for radiation therapy. Yes. I'm sorry that you want that, but no, you can't have it. And to be fair, in my opinion, it should go the same way with hormones and the medicalization of, mastectomy and other things that we can go through. No is a complete sentence, and it's perfectly okay. I think that bolstering the entrance criteria back to a significant level of gatekeeping is probably the stance that I've been most consistent on. And I think the reason that I feel that way is that the social confusion that's being born out of the Jeffrey Marshes and Lily Tinos and all the rest of them, it's not sustainable.
Right.
It's not. Yeah. We've stretched the rubber band too far, and it's losing its elasticity, which means it could break. And the last thing that we want as functional, integrated transsexual adult people who have moved into this life and are now live here is we don't want to see all of that break, because if that breaks, obviously we're going to have a really
There's a few moving parts here. Like, one is a little bit selfish, of course, because like I said, the three of us are binary, generally integrated into society. People who are probably, for the most part, generally accepted as female you're given that presumption of femaleness based on appearance and how we talk and how we carry ourselves. And we had a good thing going in the sense that we lived at a time in history where we were able to access these therapies, medical therapies, surgical therapies, not have to live and die with lifelong gender dysphoria, be able to access the kind of resources that allowed us to transition and be generally accepted as women and live lives as women. And we see people like you mentioned, Jeffrey Marsh and Lily Tino, who are drawing the public's eye in a negative way and who are providing fuel for people who are anti-trans and providing rationality for them to tear down the entire project that brought the three of us into existence.
Right.
And that is, from a purely selfish perspective, a bad thing for me and you and anyone else who is integrated. The progressive side would also argue, though, that if you are an individual and you believe in body autonomy and personal freedom, and as long as you aren't necessarily going right into someone's face with it, like, there's plenty of weirdos out there of all stripes and colors and, people, I know it's not necessarily a constitutional protection to be weird, but it's pretty damn close, of hyper individuality, that if a person is a Lily Tino, that person has the right to exist as a Lily Tino in terms of, I want to access hormones so I can look like this and grow my beard or behave bizarrely online, and that's my right as an individual. But we also recognize that the existence, especially in the social media era, of those people creates a huge target on the back of all trans people, including us, and impacts on the ability of us to live our lives. Now, getting back to the physician aspect of it, physicians have traditionally countenanced this behavior, the desire of someone to become a Lily Tino or a Jeffrey Marsh, because the rationalization was that it wasn't purely cosmetic, that even if you didn't make a formal diagnosis, that you were just whatever. My goal is to make people's lives better. And whether that's by doing an angioplasty or doing a colonoscopy or giving hormone therapy, I'm making this person's life better, live longer, higher quality of life, however you may define it, even though we never really had the data to back that up. We just were doing it on face. But you're correct. Doctors should not necessarily be involved in just prescribing a vice.
Correct.
Alcohol can make you feel better too for a while.
Well, they used to prescribe smoking.
Yeah, or cocaine.
We all learned better from that.
And we still prescribe opioids, and sometimes inappropriately. And so the point is that some people would argue, well, if you want to make this a vice, just make it like a vice. Sell it next to the cigarettes and people can buy their HRT. And if they want to use HRT, even if it might be bad for them, let them.
Right. And it's what comes after that.
Yeah.
Okay. You don't see somebody walk into a public restaurant or a public restaurant anymore and light up a cigarette.
That's
okay.
Exactly
You're free
right.
to have your vice, but you're restricted in your behavior.
Yeah.
And, I think that is the major social argument that the TERF started at. that reactionary kind of Holden Caulfield syndrome where people are trying to protect, I feel like it's because we moved the medical needle, okay, into accommodating the personal without considering the impact on the social.
Yes.
Right. Which is what we saw happen with opioids as well. We want this person to be in comfort after their surgeries. We want them to have as much pain relief as they need. Oh, along comes addiction, right?
Right.
So in the case of putting people into this weird stasis where they could be chemically castrated by their taking of medication, specifically for adults who go on cross-sex hormones, sexual reproductive intention should be taken into consideration. And let me tell you a little bit of a story from my personal life that just kind of punctuates this point. So when I was born with some congenital abnormalities that required me to have a number of surgeries as a child. My testosterone production was very low. And as such, there was some question, some ambiguity as to whether or not I could have children. Okay. So as my life progressed, I always tell people I don't really have a memory of not being dysphoric. There was question early on in my life with all the reconstructions and everything about what the best path would have been to raise me as female or male. So working through all of that as a young adult was difficult. And in therapy, my therapist challenged me back then. I mean, this is the mid-'80s that I was going through these therapies, yes. Right? The therapist is like, you don't want this life. It's incredibly difficult. It's extremely hard. Plus, you don't know if you can have kids. You might want to have kids, right? You might want to have a family. So as I went through that process and kind of continually put myself on hold as like a wait and see, let me get through this process. We worked on healthy adaptations, coping strategies, fresh air, activities, quality of life. I suddenly realized that I could become a parent, and that was really important to me. And I'm grateful that I have 4 adult grown children now as that result. But had I been raised today, and I had gone and said, hey, listen, I'm experiencing these dysphoric feelings. I've never felt as if I belonged in a male space. I am enculturated and personally, indicate all these femininities. I would have been put on hormones and my 4 children would not exist. So when we take a look at the idea of, this progressive sense of you have the right to exist, you absolutely have the right to exist. You can do, like I said, wave your hands, just don't strike anybody. The problem that I have with the entrance into the medicalization process without appropriate gatekeeping, which is essentially an evaluation, not just of your dysphoria, but of the rest of your life. They have to evaluate where you are. Can you sustain a transition? Is a question that should be being asked currently that's not, right? And so to launch somebody onto this pathway wherein they're going to be medicalized with hormones, possibly sterilizing themselves, possibly causing secondary sex care changes to their body that they will forever live with, possibly with regret, enter whichever detransitioner you'd like to enter now into the conversation. It becomes... I'm not going to say malpractice, but it becomes ethically questionable to just say, hey, you have a right to go on hormones. I'm not sure that's true. Okay. And I think that as a society, we have to work that through. And I realize that this is not a popular position, but I look back from my 50s and I look at everything that I went through. And I realize that our goal is to become asymptotic. Right? We have a line that is woman that's clearly defined. Okay, that's not hard to understand. And we do our best to approach it, but we never attain it. We have to take a look at the trajectory of that line to ensure that a person entering this, number one, is doing so from a good place. Joe, like you said, not a significant life event that triggered this. And we have to make sure that in the long run for their life goals, they are able to evaluate that first of all. So comorbidities and such need to be eradicated. And then once they have evaluated that, we sustain that for a time under tempering to make sure that that's the case, and then enter into the medicalization with the intention of completion and assimilation. All of that is missing. And the progressive concept that you can be anyone that you can be is great singularly, but it is not great culturally.
Yeah.
Okay, so great for you. You get to feel great. You get to do this, do that. I would love to have, red hair down to my knees. I can't pull that off. I have the wrong skin tone, right? So, like, trying to figure out how a person is going to enter into the space of larger culture needs to be reintroduced, and it needs to be held. I'm a very unpopular person within the trans community because of this idea. But I really believe it is important. And clarifying these things, I think, in the conversation protects our healthcare. It helps women move past, this concept of being constantly under threat by trans people. It helps society define laws in a way that won't take away our rights, but it also protects the rights of the rest of the majority. And I think all of those things are conservative values, to be able to evaluate down to the furthest minutia the best possible solution that we can do. Whereas from the progressive side, we start at the individual and we deprioritize down to the larger culture. And I don't think that's healthy.
Yeah. So one of the things that, just to push back just a little bit on some of it is, the difference between sort of, like you mentioned, addiction as being like, we don't get people addicted to drugs, or we try not to get people addicted to drugs, even though it might feel good in the moment, because, you mentioned, because there's obviously societal implications to having a large population of addicts in terms of its implications on crime and their ability to raise families and work, and, and that's all important. But also addiction in and of itself has negative effects. Even though you might feel good in the moment, it has long-term negative effects on the individual. There are many trans people who will report, and a lot of this is always by self-report because we don't have an objective indicator of who feels well or who's happy, that even though their lives, if you look at them objectively, you go like, this looks like a horror show, or this looks like a disaster, and you ask them, how you doing this? Like, now that I'm living in my gender, I feel so much better, even though my life is kind of in turmoil, even though before I had a wife and 2 kids, now I'm living in a basement apartment, and even though before I was making $150,000 a year, and now I have a GoFundMe, and you ask them, well, how are you doing? Well, at least I'm living my authentic life. That's a very common narrative in the trans community, where objectively you look at someone and you say that their life is not doing great, but we're imposing this external judgment because it looks messy or because it looks chaotic, that they're not living a good life. And I worry because I think someone could look at my life and say, well, you threw away a lot too. Your life could have been objectively better. And they have a point. Like, if I had stayed and not transitioned, I probably wouldn't have lost. There's a lot of money I spent making this happen. There are a lot of opportunities I missed out on making this happen. I probably could be some, the chief of medicine, or own my own clinic and have a $5 million house instead of, like, those things are all true. And someone could look at it and say, I threw some of that away for this, and think that's an odd choice to make. I clearly think I made the good choice here because I'm a lot happier, even though I've objectively thrown away a lot of things. And so I'm always a little bit apprehensive to, even though, like I said, people's lives can look chaotic and in turmoil, of making that judgment when people say that they're doing things that make them feel better. And then the other point about conservatism, and where I think, where I agree with you, is that we don't want to do things that affect other people. So like you talk about waving your hands around, that it shouldn't touch someone else's face. But where I think a lot of the points of tension are coming up are not where you're actually hitting someone's face, but where someone is seeing the motion of your hands, or someone feeling the breeze that is coming off your hands because you're moving them around so much, and saying that's an affront to me. And I'm not certain, and these are hard lines to draw. It's easy to say when someone punches you right in the face to say you shouldn't do that. It's harder to say, you're moving your hands around a lot and it's making me nervous. And my nervousness carries some weight, and you should change your behavior because I'm nervous, or you should change your behavior because your behavior is making me uncomfortable, or because your behavior is making me feel threatened, even though you haven't actually vocalized a threat. And so I think a lot of these issues fall into that realm of this tension between I can do whatever I want and I'm actually starting to affect other people. And it's hard to know. And obviously where the tension is that we're drawing that line in different ways or in different places.
Well, and, I think maybe 6 to 8 years ago, people really were concerned with the hand waving. Now people are just standing there saying, "Stop waving your hands, or I'll cut them off." Okay, they've had enough. The reason why in my opinion, that they have had enough is that we as a community, our most progressive elements, when somebody said, "Hey, your hands are making me uncomfortable," they moved them closer to their face. Okay.
Yeah.
And
They
so
said it shouldn't make you uncomfortable. You're actually transphobic if you say that.
Yeah, exactly.
How dare you
You're
say that?
uncomfortable because you're a bigot. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, and this insistence that, against all of reality, they're making claims and definitions against somebody's objections, which began as mild objections. They're not mild anymore. Your timeline, my timeline, all of our timelines can show that the objections are no longer mild. We have a sitting member of Congress who literally makes it her daily, X revenue to sit and slam people like us.
Right. Or when we say things like, "Oh, a penis is just an unusual body part for a woman."
Yeah, stop it.
It's
exactly.
Come on.
Cut it out. Yeah. Right. Sexual dimorphism is it serves an evolutionary purpose. Eric Weinstein would tell you this. There are in-betweens, but we have general consensus over what threat and non-threat is. And if you can't operate within that reality space, nobody's going to take you seriously. And so that's been, one of my biggest objectives, speaking from the position of being a trans conservative, is that, hey, I recognize you conservative people, you have legitimate concerns. And I know you've both seen me in these conversations before. I will stay as pleasant as the person is with me. But usually what happens if I engage in the same way with an overtly progressive trans right activist, the first thing they tell me is, you're crazy. They're going to eat your face. You're self-deluded. Why do you want to be like Blair White? Why do you want to be like this person? Don't you see you're hurting us? I'm not doing any of those things.
Or you're being used by them, right?
Or I'm being used by them, right? As if I don't have personal agency to get this far.
Yeah, not anymore.
Right? Exactly. So no, I think, Laura, when we come back to it, the medical community has really moved into a place where it's individual focused without being comprehensive. Okay, so I'm taking you at face value in this quick 9-minute interaction that I have with you, and I'm going to give you the best healing I can in this 9 minutes without consideration of the long term down the road. We see that in the opioid epidemic. Obviously, people aren't monitoring to make sure that they're not maintaining levels of these things past what the prescription was, for example. In the same way, I don't know if either of you have encountered this online before, but there are a number of people that I've encountered, specifically within progressive spaces, who say that this is how I feel better. This is the best SSRI I ever took. This is the best anti-anxiety I've ever gotten. And what it is as they're doing this and they're experiencing some sort of metabolic change in their brain, they're also limiting their social circle into people who are affirming of who they are. So you see people leave the greater society and move into smaller cohorts, wherein they're being reinforced to be as individual as possible. We used to jokingly call this terminal uniqueness, in the sense that you're going to go to all ends to be the one that stands out in a room, right? So that concept has become reinforced from the progressive, in my opinion, that, be as wild and crazy as you want to. Here, I'll platform you. I'll throw you on TikTok. I'll invite you to the White House so you can take your shirt off. Yeah. See, these kind of things don't comport with normal society any more so than Nancy Mace's behavior comports with normal society.
I would argue
they're equally bad.
Yeah,
like
the same reward structures in place, but just for different. Yeah,
exactly.
Qualifications.
To kind of bring this all to a close, Rachel, how would you, as a conservative, fix it from within? Like, what's your solution? Obviously, you're in favor of more gatekeeping, but give us the top-down, bottom line. If these top 3 things, or however you want to kind of summarize it, like, or maybe the lowest hanging fruit, or kind of the thing that you think should be the priority right now, given everything we've talked about.
I'll tell you what, that on a solution right out of the box, I'd be rich, right? But I would say that we really do have to dial up gatekeeping. We have to understand definitionally what we're working with. I think definitionally there is a pronounced difference in the same way between a social progressive and more of a traditional liberal. We know that difference. There is a difference between what you would call a TRA or a transgender person and maybe somebody who is identifying as transsexual and is a little bit more conservative about who they are as a person. We need to define those definitions. We need to get away from the disgust baiting that's taking place. We have to get away from the phobias being thrown around, the assumption of hatred, and quite frankly, the weaponization of disgust. We have to get away from that, both in the trans movement and in the TERF movement. No conversation can take place while somebody's referring to your rot pocket, or while, you're turning around and you're calling somebody, a handmaiden, whatever. You can't get into these conversations from those tenets. I think that we have to be rational about where society's position is right now. And then we have to begin that slow climb that we experienced with the gay rights movement in the 70s and 80s. It's a slow climb. Like, we have to do some reassuring. We also have to limit ourselves to deplatform people like Lily Tino. She has the right to be as crazy as she wants to be, but she doesn't have a right to be in a Disney bathroom while she's doing it. Okay, so please stop those things. We need some rationality. We need greater rational voices that aren't just driving for clicks, right? So you have, Nancy Mace on this side who gets all of her attention because of her stance on trans rights, right? And you have somebody on this other side who is out here, platforming drag queens. There's nothing wrong with drag queens, but it's not appetizing to the public, and it's a bad representation of trans people. So we have to get down around a conversation and really get to an idea where we can move forward. Just like the bathroom issue, I think there are realistic approaches that solve that problem. The person who coined the word TERF themselves had basically said that, we can't work from an imaginary threat to impose restrictions on somebody who's actually under a threat, right? Now, you can take that from either direction.
Yeah.
Can't you? So we have to get into a position where we can structurally build some kind of policy around bathrooms, for example, that takes away this social tension. This seems to be the big driver, right? We heard in the last election cycle, kids, sports, bathrooms, women's spaces being all part of that. Until we can clearly define what those concerns really are, statistically and methodologically, ideologically even, being honest about why there is a resistance or why there is a progression forward. What are we really talking about here? Because there are a lot of us out here who have been living quietly for a really long time, completely unharassed, completely integrated into society, assimilated into.
Yeah.
We've not had trouble.
When you ask people questions, when you ask people questions about bathroom and you say, should trans people be allowed in the bathroom? Now you get a majority of people who are against it, and understandably so. But if you were to say, put up your picture, I'm just using you as an example because you're here right now, put up your picture and say, this is Rachel. She's a trans woman. Do you have a problem with you using the bathroom? It's probably an 80-20 issue in favor. 80% of people probably have absolutely no issue with you being in the bathroom with them at the same time. And this comes back to something I think very important, which you're saying is that we have to sort of define in the public side that we are not Latino. Now, it's hard to do.
You can roll that even further and talk about preoperative versus postoperative. And they're like, well, how are we ever going to check that? But, really, at the end of the day, work from the needs end rather than the imposition end. People who have undergone gender reassignment surgery, they need to have the same accommodations that somebody who is natively born with similar parts.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know some of the, and I recognize some of the TERFs that say, well, you should have never had that surgery and put yourself in that position. But at the same time, one of the challenges we have is we as much as we like to say, I wish Lily Tino would get sucked into a
vortex
into some vortex and disappear. She's clearly not going to. She's empowered. She's making money doing this. The platform likes having crazy people on it because they drive traffic to the platform. She's going to get 1,000 times more views for her next video than this is, because people like crazy. people like to feel angry. Whereas, getting our position, which I think is the right position, whether you're taking it from a slightly progressive position or your more conservative position of relatability, of saying this is who we are. We are people who are more like you than we're not like you. Like, we want the same things. We have families, we have jobs, we do our shopping, we make dinner, we have people over, we go to the same shows, we're in the military, we're in all walks of life, as opposed to the kind of people who get attention, which are the people who are bizarre. And the other thing we don't have, and which I think was part of the struggle in terms of organizing a movement around assimilationism, is that we've all got other jobs. And we've all got competing responsibilities. We're raising families. Like, we are not just individuals living ourselves and able to march in every march that comes up or shout at every person that needs to be shouted at. Like, when we're done here, I've got to go write a paper, and I've got to go pick up groceries for my family, and I've got to make dinner. And like, those are the kind of things that many of us who are trying to sell this message of, look at us, we're just like you, and they're going to say, well, we don't want to hear your story because it's kind of boring. It's relatable, but it's also kind of like, I go grocery shopping too. Big deal. So I think that's really the challenge, that we're stuck in. Like, we know what we want, how to get the money to actually make that the vision. Because, like I said, I'm convinced if you could put you and 1,000 other women and men who are trans, who are like you, in front of the public's eye, and make us the predominant vision of what it means to be trans, even recognizing that there may be some weirdos out there, our rights come back. And our rights come back. And our ability to live as we want and live freely.
And our ability to discourage the extremities of the bell curve also becomes more plausible, right? If people are being unhealthy with the way that they're actualizing what they want, then they're on the extremities, and sometimes you got to pull people back from the extremities because you just are too far out there. You look back in the 90s, the body modification craze, people with the craziest piercing got the most attention.
Right.
And then people started hanging themselves from the rafters of warehouses with hooks in their back. People are like, okay, wait, that's a little much. So you don't see that quite as often anymore, right? So same thing when it comes to living, a life where you're just trying really to be as normal as possible. And the heavy majority of us do that. Then we can start to look at the outskirts and say, that's not representative of me. Like, I've had enough there. Like, stop.
I think that's well said.
And hopefully they lose support. Yeah. In that case.
Awesome. Well, we solved it. All right. Mission accomplished. Just like Bush in 03.
At least we got a plan. We've got a plan now.
We have a hope now, is what it is, really.
Yeah. Yeah. So like I said, I know we're not going to agree on everything. But I really like, what I really appreciate about listening to you talk today is that it's, not that I was surprised by this, but it's so thoughtful. And it's not just simply saying this is the way it has to be, but providing, like I said, you talk about sort of the true spirit of conservatism, of one that was sort of founded on rationality and discussion, and of sort of looking at competing views and deciding whether doing this change is worth the effort after looking at the data. And I hate to say it, sadly missing from many of the kind of people who tend to call themselves conservative. So I hope that this line of thinking can, if you're calling yourself the trans conservative online, that it becomes sort of the avatar for conservatism, and maybe not just trans conservatism, but for conservatism, bring conservatism back to being conservative again. That would be, I think, from a progressive standpoint, it would be nice to have those types of conservatives as an adversary again.
Well, then you get the bipartisanship, right? Like, that's the key, is having that middle ground. So, Rachel, I want to thank you so much for coming on today and bearing with us with the delays and everything. And I really appreciated hearing your perspective, and I'm excited to keep following you online, and maybe we'll have you back again, because I enjoyed just listening to you talk. So thank you.
Yeah. Like, what I'd love to have at some point, because I know there's, I've spoken to a number of different, trans conservative women who, and like I said, I want to do a show with like a normal trans conservative panel and just have and kind of nerd out on that, and then have one with like some, if there are a few left, some normal trans liberals who are kind of not off on the extremes, and have a similar conversation. I think would be really a really nice way to spend a morning.
Definitely.
I think it'd be a great way to spend a morning.
Yeah.
So please include me in the future. It's
Absolutely.
nice to see you both. Joe, it was really nice to talk with you. I'm sorry we didn't have more chance to talk. Laura and I are a little bit more familiar, but I can't wait to talk to you again soon.
Yeah,
Definitely.
don't pass it. Don't let that one pass you by. It's really worth it. Joe's fantastic.
Awesome.
No, thank you so much, Rachel.
It's my pleasure. Take care, you guys.
Bye.
Bye.